Hi, Tina. We're so glad that you could join us today.
So am I. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And we're looking forward to talking to you just about your experience conducting qualitative research. So I'd like to ask you first if you could just tell us how you came to be doing the kind of research that you do.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I think I always sort of had an interest in multiple forms of data when it came to asking questions about different educational phenomena. So I enjoy survey design and survey data analysis. I enjoy looking at large-scale data sets. Much of my work focuses on qualitative data analysis, although I also do some mixed methods work. The qualitative data analysis that I've engaged in has primarily been motivated by my sort of dissatisfaction with the kinds of answers that I can get from traditional large-scale data sets. I find the working with these types of data sets illuminating. I find it useful with respect to certain questions, but the questions that are driving my research bring me to, or lead me to using more traditional qualitative methods. I'm interested in understanding the interaction between different, very powerful contextual influences and different educational outcomes, particularly with respect to schools and school districts in urban settings.
And could you tell us a little bit about your dissertation research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my dissertation looked at a case of centralization at the district level. So sort of centralization both in terms of the organization of a district as well as the types of policies and reforms that were being rolled out in this particular case. And I was interested in it because when I looked across schools and interviewed principals just as a graduate student, I oftentimes heard educators and leaders saying that they were doing something, but they weren't entirely sure why they were carrying out a certain mandate or why they were following a certain set of guidelines. And it oftentimes, when I tried to trace back these questions about why, it oftentimes led me to the central office. At the same time, I saw that more and more school leaders and teachers were talking about the role of testing and the role of high-stakes accountability policies inside of their classrooms. So that took me to the district office, the central office, to see how districts were grappling with these policies that are now holding districts, not just individual schools, accountable for test-based school outcomes. I looked at the relationship between different attempts to standardize, a district's attempts to standardize what was happening across all of their schools and across all of their classrooms in terms of instruction, in terms of curricular materials, in terms of different professional learning for the teachers, training, things like that. And I looked at the relationship between these sort of district policies and instructional quality, in particular instructional quality for English learners and students of color. And what I found was that regardless of the degree to which schools implemented the policies as they were prescribed, or essentially adhered to more sort of standardized, more centralized ways of working, the level or the quality of instruction didn't necessarily go up for their students. So I saw in settings where there were fairly low levels of implementation, instructional quality still was lagging in terms of its specificity for English learners and its sensitivity or its responsiveness to students of color. And then I found in high implementation settings something very similar was occurring. So it made me then sort of take a step back and want then to go and ask questions about what was happening in the central office. If implementation with these types of sort of standardized, more centralized policies didn't necessarily correlate with different levels of instructional quality for the most marginalized students, what was happening in the district that led to that? So then I spent some time looking at the district politics around the policymaking itself.
So maybe you could tell us about another study that you're involved in and how you think about the interaction of kind of questions that interest you in research design.
Okay, all right. So in another study that I carried, I looked at the relationship, or I looked at, I'll take a step back. So there's a broad trend right now in education, as I'm sure you're familiar with, where we're seeing more and more actors sort of entering the educational landscapes or the institutional field. So we're not simply, when we study education, we're not simply studying schools and districts and formal educational actors anymore. And we're studying other non-system actors, including different intermediary organizations that are intended or designed to provide different instructional support services for schools. With the inception of high-stakes accountability policies, we've seen a proliferation of these types of support providers for schools, in part because some schools and districts are under pressure to maintain a certain degree of test performance, so they're looking for outside providers to provide guidance and support that they don't find readily available to them inside of their schools or their districts, but also because these providers have been written into some of the policies, right? So we have provisions now that require districts to spend a certain amount of their Title I funds, for example, on supplemental service providers, as one example. I was interested in understanding what happened as far as instructional quality went for the most marginalized students in schools that were partnering with these intermediary organizations. So I carried out a study of one national intermediary organization and looked at 6 of its schools, all in urban environments, and spent some time studying, along with my research team, with my graduate students, spent some time observing classrooms and looking at the different types of instruction that took place in its schools. The intermediary organization marketed itself as providing instruction that was specific to English learners, an instruction that was culturally relevant for the student populations that the schools were serving, as well as providing or promoting instruction that was aligned with the state standards that are now aligned with standardized tests. And what we found was that while the organization believed that it was sort of promoting sort of all 3 sort of types of instruction and content in its schools, what we found was that there was actually quite a bit of variance there. We didn't see as much evidence of English learner strategies in place in schools that were still serving high numbers of English learners, or strong evidence of culturally relevant pedagogy in many of its classrooms. But what we did see across schools very consistently was a strong pattern of standards-based content. So that's very consistent with the literature on policy implementation that's already taught us that instructionally it's oftentimes easier to change the content than it is the pedagogy. And we saw that, which raises questions for me then about the amount of resources that are going into pulling in these other actors inside of public education, and they're now providing fairly core instructional services, oftentimes in many schools and districts. But it raises questions about the degree to which we're changing the actual pedagogical quality for some of our most marginalized students.
So when you completed that research, what, if anything, did you do with the research to try to engage policymakers? There seem to be some pretty evident policy implications of that work, and for your dissertation as well. So I guess more generally, what has been your experience in thinking about how policymakers might hear about or respond to the research?
So I think I've looked for opportunities to communicate research evidence to policymakers sort of across my research studies. I'm actually going to speak to a different sort of line of inquiry. I also study school turnarounds, and as you know, the phenomenon of sort of school turnarounds and policies and reforms dubbed turnarounds, that's really grown recently, and that's grown in part because at the federal level we have the school improvement grant programs, reforms that now include school turnaround as one of a menu of reforms that schools who receive school improvement grant funds are required to implement. Under the turnaround option, we have our schools are required to lay off its principal and its teachers and the new principal has the option to replace up to half the staff, but to really revamp what's happening inside of the school. That turnaround option is inconsistent with what decades of rigorous research has shown about the potential of mass layoffs to improve the quality of schools. But it's being utilized and actually being expanded across the country right now as it's a fairly popular reform model for the nation's most struggling schools. I've written about that with my colleague Michelle Renee at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform in multiple areas, and we've attempted to engage in conversation with policymakers in a few different ways. In one way is that we've attempted to, or we've written up our findings about school turnarounds and the analogous research, or research that sort of predated the school turnaround phenomenon. We've written up our findings in different venues. So we've branched out beyond scholarly publications and written reports that are accessible to a broad variety of audiences. We've also communicated the findings of these reports to media outlets and worked in conjunction with an organization that commissioned one of our, the original report that we wrote, the National Education Policy Center. We worked in conjunction with them to really communicate to the media as well as to policymakers what these findings suggest for the potential of the turnaround option to actually improve the quality of schooling for urban students.
Have you felt like that has been able to gain traction with policymakers, and if so, what kind of policymaker?
Okay. So here in Wisconsin, the Department of Public Instruction has actually used our report on school turnarounds to guide its, or to design its guidelines for schools who receive school improvement grants. Or school improvement grant funds. So they sat down with a report and called us and said, we want to talk to you about the content of the report and to think about ways that or to run past you sort of ideas we have for actually implementing some of the ideas in the report. So the report doesn't stop at critiquing the research-based evidence. It also includes a series of more than half a dozen suggestions for how states and districts and the federal government can do this differently, can invest in turnarounds in a more comprehensive, context-sensitive way. When Wisconsin is one state that's actually used that report to guide its school turnarounds, its school turnaround reforms. We also had a chance to hear the U.S. Secretary of Education's response to the report when it originally came out, and there was some back and forth communication around that as well. We've also heard from school board members and leaders in other state departments of education, sort of across the country, here and there, where they're using the report, much like here in Wisconsin, to guide or to design their guidelines for schools.
That's great, thank you. So I want to switch focus for a few minutes and ask you about working with graduate students. What advice would you have to a graduate student interested in using primarily qualitative methods to ask questions? I'm keeping it vague because we have students with such diverse interests, but they're kind of looking forward and thinking about questions and research design and later analysis and writing. And what advice would you have for them?
Yeah. So I oftentimes hear my graduate students say, well, I really want to write a dissertation. I really want to write write up a case study, or I really want to do or carry out a dissertation that draws on survey research, or I really want to do this. And I say, that's fine. It's wonderful to have our interests, but I always advise them to take a step back, and before they pick which methodological tools they're going to pull out of that toolbox, to ask themselves what the problem is that they're interested in investigating and what that phenomenon is. And I ask them to then design a question about that problem. And that question should then drive the methods. And we oftentimes do it the other way around. We find different methods, and we find, because of our own educational experiences and our own professional training and our own academic learning, some resonate with us more than others. That's fine to have your preferences, but I strongly urge them to slow down before they pick the method, even the qualitative or quantitative tradition, and think about the phenomena that are most exciting and intellectually stimulating to them. Ask a question about those phenomena, and then let that answer drive the tools that they select.
And now moving on, they've conducted research. It's a great research design and set of questions, and they have in front of them what, particularly for qualitative research, is often a very large body of massed data.
Yes.
And they're moving towards analysis and writing. What are some pieces of advice you found useful for grad students at those phases?
Well, I oftentimes hear graduate students saying they don't know when to stop, right? When do I stop coding? I could keep going forever. And I've definitely been that researcher coding my qualitative data, wondering when I'm ready to stop. I think it's important to bring your data in and have conversations with multiple audiences about it, other graduate students, with your advisor, other intellectual mentors, and have conversations about what it is that you're analyzing to decide, okay, to help sort of pinpoint areas where you may sort of have certain sort of intellectual blind spots. And the moment you open up this conversation, which can be a very sort of solitary intellectual exercise, sort of analyzing your qualitative data, the moment you open it up to multiple perspectives, you now have multiple eyes on the same data and patterns, and I think new findings can emerge through being in conversation with others and sort of opening up what is oftentimes a very privatized process to multiple people. At the same time, like you said, that qualitative data is necessarily sort of rich and deep, and it can include a fairly expansive data set, and that can oftentimes become cumbersome the first time around when we are essentially practicing our different qualitative data analysis techniques. And this is one of the reasons that I started using the technique of qualitative comparative analysis. I had a data set that I was working with my research team from the study that I talked about earlier with the intermediary organization that was engaging in different sort of instructional supports for its schools. And one of the forms of data that we collected were instructional task analyses, where our students walked in with a predefined protocol or observation protocol for capturing instructional tasks. And they were able to write up qualitatively what each complete instructional task looked like. But in the end, we had probably 60-some tasks to look across and to code, and we could code that using conventional qualitative techniques, but sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around what a pattern of 58 instances of a particular event looks like. Comparative analysis allows us to sort of reduce that data and to systematically minimize these patterns in ways that we can identify multiple combinations of conditions that are associated with the outcome of interest. So we utilized it in our study originally, and now I'm using it in other studies as well, as a tool to help us reduce what can be a very sort of large, overwhelming amount of data, and to look at it systematically.
Two more questions, if I could. Mm-hmm. What have you found to be the or one of the most difficult ethical moments in your own research, and how did you address that issue?
And I've talked to my students about this. We can't always predict what we're going to observe when we're going out and doing field work, and we're entering other people's lives, and they're letting us into their lives, and that's a very privileged place to occupy. I've been in a setting where the details of my participants' lives very much affected their professional experiences, the experiences that I was observing. And I needed to I knew that that was a factor in explaining what was happening in my research site. I had to ask myself whether, even though we were maintaining full confidentiality, whether revealing some of these personal experiences was, even if we maintained the full identity of the participants, whether that was fair to my participants. And in the end, even though we would have been complying with all of the formal IRB regulations, I didn't feel like it was sort of ethically I was being ethically responsible to my participants, who agreed to sort of let me into their lives, and then went, in doing so, then revealed a degree of sensitive information that could have been included in the study, but I needed to make that judgment call not to. So there's that. And the other time is, youth, working with youth, when your youth are your participants. It's a fine line between being a 17-year-old and being an 18-year-old. And an 18-year-old technically doesn't qualify as a youth, but I wear multiple hats. I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, I'm a mother, I'm a partner, and I know that when you're 18, you may be legally an adult, and the IRB may treat you differently. But what you share with researchers may be just as sensitive and worthy of, I think, a higher level of protection. Or a very high level of protection, as if you were 17 or if you were 5 years old. So I think we can, I talk to my students about this, we can follow the IRB guidelines to the letter of the law, but we still have to make judgment calls about individuals and their lives. And sometimes youth, even when they're legal adults, we still have to take into consideration their full range of circumstances in terms of protecting them.
You.
It's a partial answer, but
no, I think they're both really important topics for students to think about. And as you said, what they do is fall outside of the formal IRB structure. So you can letter of the law and never really have to think about this.
Right.
So that's very helpful. Thank you. This one may take a few minutes too, but do you have any articles or books that you would really recommend? Every grad student should probably read X.
Given that it relates to, are you talking about in the world?
Research.
You're talking about, but you're not talking about my work.
No,
you're talking
it could
about,
be yours. It could be yours, but in the world too. Yeah.
Okay. Go back and read the historical accounts in Raymond Callahan's Cult of Efficiency. I think there was a lot of prescience there. Callahan wrote about the movement towards more scientific managerial ways of working in public education, and he connected it to the social efficiency movement around the turn of the century. And he, in painstakingly detail, demonstrates the ways in which the social efficiency experts, principles, and approaches to organizing and leading schools was very much still present 60 years ago. And I think any student of educational policy who reads that book today is going to see quite a few of the same themes that Callahan identified quite some time ago, still present in our schools today.
Thank you. That was wonderful.